if you look at the history over the years, India and the Middle East have always had a corridor into Europe. Okay. The spice route, the gold route. Okay. Both concepts contributed to the India, ME and EU corridor. This came from trust, relationships, and reliability being built into the system. Information in those days was limited and scarce. Travel was restricted, so you had to make decisions based on intermediaries whom you could trust and rely on. For exports from India and Asia, the Arab middlemen proved to be the reliable, trustworthy partners whose word could be relied upon, who brought news and gossip back to them, who created exotic marketing stories for India to the Europeans, and most important, you could rely on them for the safety of your money. They had a healthy banking practice, which made the corridors one of the most successful corridors in the world. The India-Middle East-Europe economic corridor can be viewed as a modern reimagination of the ancient Golden Road, a term used to describe the extensive trade and cultural networks that connected India with the Middle East and Europe from 250 BCE to 1200 CE. Therefore, in today's context, which is a little different, we have much more information at tap. We know what happened in each market on our phones on the same instance across the world. Need for intermediaries has dropped. Most people prefer to travel themselves and meet their customers. Business is becoming competitive. Space and margin for agents and partners do not add direct value to the business. That has disappeared. Today, for one to be an agent or a partner in trade, unless there is tremendous value added in some form, we do not consider taking on extra routings or different routes through different partners. The answer perhaps, what can IMEC do? How to justify the existence and provide a solution and look at what IMEC holds for the future? The answer lies in perhaps the following. The geopolitical realignments and risk management strategies, which countries in the world are our allies. Where are my goods, my money and my people safe? Which countries and partners can help me open markets using their good offices so I have a safe, sure and sustainable market presence? Who are the players who have built reliable and safe infrastructure that can be relied upon so I do not have to reinvent the wheel? My entry becomes easier just as it flows through the existing pipeline with other goods and services. Difficult to open doors are opened up for me due to better and excellent relations and diplomatic channels. Problems are solved for me due to special relations enjoyed by my partners who would trust me, who have the trust of the other party, state or nation, where I am yet to develop my relationships. Most efficient transshipment ports, effective routes to speedily delivering to EU and open channels that do not hinder trade flows are important areas to consider. Best common standards for storage, not affecting the quality of your products or applying required sensitivity to temperature, light conditions, whether you're selling perishables, pharmaceuticals, flowers or wine, or creating a common language of quality standards and contracts. Reaching a better cultural and economic integration in education, literature, music, arts and other such areas of cooperation that create special bonds between different cultures and people. We could build a focus on food security, water management, collaborative energy security and sustainable green technologies. As India redefines its place in the global supply chains, the India-Middle East-European Economic Corridor offers an unprecedented opportunity to strengthen partnerships with the European Union. But infrastructure alone does not build prosperity. It is institutions, trust and collaborations that truly make corridors work. This session is about how India and Europe can walk that path together with policy foresight, business leadership and strategic alignment. 4 areas of united efforts that are needed by partners countries to realize IMEC. I've tried to put some of these together just as a thought provoker. Political alignment and strategic commitment. Sustained high-level political will, including the heads of state, ministers and strategic partners must keep IMEC a top priority in bilateral and multilateral dialogues. Formalize governance structures. Create a multilateral IMEC governing council comprising India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, EU and US to oversee planning, coordination and dispute resolution. Treaty or agency framework. Create a multilateral IMEC governing council comprising of these countries and set up dispute resolution frameworks. Treaty or agreement framework is negotiate a treaty on IMEC cooperation like the European Energy Charter that codifies rights, responsibilities, dispute mechanisms and investment protection for corridor projects. Second area is infrastructure financing collaboration, Global Infrastructure Financing Alliance, Set up an IMEC investment fund involving foreign sovereign wealth funds, global banks, and private bank investors. Look at blended financing models. Develop projects through a mix of grants, loans, guarantees, private capital to de-risk investments and attract infrastructure funds. Green and sustainable financing. Prioritizing the financing that meets ESG standards to attract institutional and climate-focused investors. The third area is harmonized standards and regulatory coordination. Unified trade, customs, and logistics standards. Developing common procedures, security protocols, logistics regulations, and digital trade standards across IMEC countries. Mutual recognition of certifications. Allow seamless movement of goods through recognition of product safety standards, certificates of origin, and transport safety norms. Sustainable standards alignment. Define common environmental benchmarks like carbon emission standards to ensure green credentials for the corridor. And fourth, and not the least, is technology integration and digital cooperation. Create a smart corridor, invest in AI-driven cargo management, blockchain-enabled customs clearance, and fiber optic connectivity through the corridor. Cybersecurity collaboration. Establish joint cybersecurity standards and protocols to protect trade data and digital infrastructure across the IMEC route. Digital single window. Build a real-time corridor-wide trade platform where documents are processed once and accepted all across all countries. You can consider anything can be achieved provided we put trust and faith together in collaborative approaches. And I think that's basically what we are talking about in today's session. What do you see as the most urgent supply chain gaps between India and EU that IMEC can directly address?
When I heard this whole thing about IMEC, I mean, not just now, but the last couple of years, my mind as a person who has some experience in the cargo industry goes to what kind of cargo would you even be transporting on routes such as these? I realize it's much more than purely a cargo route, but at the end of the day, that's what's going to tie the entire thing together. And a lot of goods are not going to make it through this route. So, you know, it's a very hot topic the last couple of days as to how many iPhones India is going to be producing in the next couple of years. India is going to produce 40, 50 million iPhones a year very soon. That kind of cargo is never going to go over this route because it's going to get on an aircraft from Bangalore or from Chennai and get flown directly to Europe or the United States. But there is a lot of stuff that's on ocean-going vessels today which could flow over into the IMEC. So a lot of low-value cargo could end up on sea rail connections, as Afaq was also speaking about this morning. So as the Indian economy grows $4, $5, $7, $10 trillion, the overflow of that low-end cargo is going to get so huge in terms of volume that could become a very natural overflow into this route. The question that comes to my mind then is, you know, do you end up designing something that's extremely expensive from an infrastructure point of view and ends up carrying relatively low-value cargo? Then you have obviously a slight proposition issue. But I think it can, to answer your question, aid India-EU trade from that point of view. The other area where India-EU trade can get helped is the fact that this corridor makes landfall in Greece. Today, the bulk of the European cargo gets into Marseille, gets into Rotterdam, into Antwerp, Hamburg, Bremerhaven. So now, for the first time, you would get a very significant amount of cargo making landfall in Greece, which means the Balkans, Central Europe, Eastern Europe suddenly is much better within reach. Today, all of that cargo is trucked from, you know, Le Havre and Marseille, etc., eastward into the rest of Europe. So from a direct market, and given that that's the part of Europe that's going to be growing the fastest, developing the fastest, that could be a good thing. So those are some of the very kind of practical questions that come to my mind.
No, good points. I think what you said is very clear. Perhaps one of the thoughts could also be that how do you dedicate certain ports which might work for as a region-specific or cargo-specific capability?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because in the cargo business, you know, certain ports specialize in certain things, like Kandla port in India imports all the recycled clothing from Europe, you know. It all lands up in Kandla. All the blades for these huge wind turbines that you see, they all come to Tuticorin port. Now, that kind of cargo, once it's been, a blade has been loaded onto a bulk vessel in Europe, they're not going to load it off and put it on a train and then load it off again and put it on a vessel and bring it to India. That thing is going to stay on its vessel from Europe straight to India. So those kinds of fine-tuning things need to be thought about. And the question that came to my mind when I was listening to the panel discussions this morning was also, what kind of value addition do you do in the Middle East, right? So, I mean, are you just railing something through Saudi Arabia, or is there any kind of value addition being done to cargo? Are you offloading cargo at any point and transforming it in some shape or form, literally, and adding value to it before it goes on its final destination?
From your position in the Indo-Spanish Chamber of Commerce, how can financial ecosystems, especially export financing and trade insurance, be better aligned to support businesses engaging with IMEC?
As Spain as a country, this IMEC is going to be a great opportunity for them. Not only India, but also the countries in Middle East on the way to this corridor. And if you look at the opportunities for Spanish financial institutions, because financial institutions in Spain is basically banks. Majority of them are banks, banking system, which finances all this transaction. Now, one, it helps the the Spanish companies to internationalize. For example, there is an agency called CESE, C-E-S-E, which is Export Credit Agency of Spain, and this helps Spanish company internationalize. So if they set up operations in any of these countries, including India, they are willing to cover the political risk. If tomorrow there's something goes wrong because of political risk, SACE covers the risk, and that helps the investor, Spanish investor. Second is the Spanish investors, also there is a trade insurance. For example, if there is they have doing trade and there is a problem with the trade and because of political reasons, the whole thing stops, again, CESE covers them that. And the third is for Indian companies. Indian companies or any companies in this region, which is in this corridor, if they are investing and they're importing equipment from Spain, then those import of equipments can be financed for up to 10 years. And these are long-term financing, which is provided by the Spanish banks, but these are covered by the CESE, the insurance agency. So what happens is if suppose an Indian company wants to import a large equipment and the Indian company wants a long-term loan, then they can approach CESE and say, look, I'm buying from the Spanish company, and the Spanish company submits an application to the CESE, the agency, and once they approve, they cover the risk. Banks like BBVA or other Spanish banks who are big players in those markets are willing to take the risk on those transactions by lending them 10 years, 5 years money for long term, and that's an opportunity for the Spanish banks to make money. So overall, if you look at this this corridor, it provides a lot of opportunity for Spanish companies. There is another agency called COFEDES, which is actually helping the, again, internationalized Spanish companies. And they're the mid and the smaller companies, they can use this system where it's, if their investments are, if they want a long-term or a medium-term loan, they can get it from this agency. And also for sustainable financing, because this agency also promotes sustainable financing in other countries where Spanish companies are involved. So overall, the Spanish system is going to benefit, and it could be a good opportunity for win-win for Spanish companies, Indian companies, as well as the companies in the region which are in the path. So I think if you look at the entire population in this region, especially the Middle East, the India and Spain and Europe, it covers around about 2.65 billion people. And so imagine the trade which can happen there. So 30% of populations living there. So trade also could be a significant amount. And this corridor is going to change maybe the landscape of trade if it's successfully implemented.
Thank you, Joiel. I just had one follow-up questions on this point, which is if you look at the potential of the corridor, it also has the potential of attracting investments from various corporates or businesses, and those businesses will probably look at acquiring assets, maybe setting up facilities, maybe doing projects or part-time, short-term projects or medium-term projects. How would the financing for such businesses work in a corridor like this? What can be done specifically by the Spanish banks and institutions?
So, for example, Indian, when this corridor sets up, it opens opportunity for investment for Spanish companies as well as Indian companies. So, if they want to borrow from the Spanish system, they can borrow under the external commercial borrowing route in India. where from Spanish banks will be willing to provide long-term loans for those projects wherever they're set up. So it's going to help the Indian companies also to borrow from the Spanish system.
Payal, perhaps you want to tell us a little bit about what France envisions its role as within the IMEC and what strategic advantage does France offer?
I think there are basically three main points. Number one, there's been a very strong political will to ensure that the IMEC is a project that is supported by France. In 2023, the French president nominated Mr. Gérard Mestralet as a special envoy for the project. And since then, a lot of work has gone in to ensure that there's been enough outreach. There have been some very important meetings in India with the port authorities in Saudi Arabia. I know that there was a presentation at the Atlantic Council as well. So on a macro level, of course, it's an extremely important project. The second point I'd like to highlight is that the Marseille port is being projected as the entry and the exit point for the IMEC. And of course, it comes with many advantages. It's the third largest port in the Mediterranean. It's a multi-modular port, you know, both on rail, river, road, and pipeline. And recently, there's been a very important concession with Lyon as well, which adds to a further expansion. Another point that I'd like to bring in is that Marseille is also home to the world's third largest shipping company, CMA CGM. And in fact, this morning, my colleagues and I, we were actually at the flagging ceremony of the first ever Indian ship called the Victoria, which was a beautiful ceremony. But the group is doing so much in India. You know, they've invested more than $200 million. They have a workforce of 17,000 people. They have 11 depots. There's so much happening. There's a new R&D center coming up. There's going to be a Seafarer Academy with more than 1,000 cadets trained by the end of this year. So it's just humongous if you start to look at the numbers. And I think maybe the third point is that Marseille is strategically positioned as an important transporter through its pipelines for hydrogen. So successfully from Marseille to the north of France and then to Switzerland and Germany. So I think with all of this, it really does position France in a very, very strong place. And I think things look very, very promising for the country.
What does France expect, let's say, India to play a significant role in this process? What have been your demands or expectations from the Indian government or the infrastructure here that needs to change or get better at so that two-way trade becomes far more effective?
I don't think I'd really comment on the infrastructure, but what I can tell you is that a lot is going on between both countries at the moment. In fact, we are actually playing a very, very active role. I don't know if many of you know, but so the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurated India's first Consulate General in Marseille in February, which is the first one out of Paris. Secondly, there are some very important events taking place this year, including ORF's first ever, Mediterranean conference, which is happening in the month of June. We are also organizing an Indian business delegation to the region of Marseille. So there's a lot of dialogue going on both ways. Next year, there's going to be a very important state visit by the French president, and we are also positioning ourselves on IMEC. And there's going to be a very large, significant conference, extremely high level, that we are going to be organizing in Mumbai. So I look forward to discussing with many of you on that.
What role should the United States play in IMEC? And how can we reconcile the initiative with Make America Great Again?
It's actually, I've noticed today, I think tomorrow there's going to be some panelists from the consulate here, but there actually hasn't been many American speakers here to talk about IMEC. And I think that it's very important to situate where we are today in Washington on IMEC to understand the history of where it came from and how the birth of IMEC was born out of the Abraham Accords, born out of, as well, with different demands that came to the White House, Jake Sullivan and the National Security Council in the last administration, that saw a lot of grand strategic vision and listened to our partners in the Emirates and in Israel and as well as other countries that listened to how can we create a collective vision and put our resources in the White House, political attention, political capital, that culminated in, under the last Sherpa process in the G20 summit in 2023, culminated in the MOU that announced IMEC, sadly, when just 1 month later, then the horrible attacks in October derailed the entire process. And so I think to understand where IMEC is today in Washington, and just to reiterate, I'm here with the Atlantic Council Middle East program. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and it was great to hear several people mention Afaq Hussein's session earlier today, who's a non-resident fellow with us here, and we're very grateful. And we're actually going to be putting out a report doing economic modeling on IMEC, showcasing and putting numbers, firm numbers, onto the cost-benefit analysis of IMEC, and so that should be coming out next month, and so we're really, really excited to continue hosting events in Washington, D.C. related to IMEC and in partnership with Vishwamitra Foundation, as well as everybody else and our partners here in India. The second part of your question, and the most important, is how do we make IMEC compatible with Make America Great Again? That's right. When J.D. Vance was here last week, like many of you probably saw, we were surprised, as well as the tone that he took, and how he actually called the U.S.-India relationship to stand up. Is that whereas the U.S.-European relationship, I mean, everybody here reads the news and knows how that's going, the U.S.-India relationship is fundamentally different. It's one of proving the value of how do you make America Great Again compatible with Make in India. And how do you actually think through a collective value proposition for American leadership in the world that can promote mutual economic benefit, achieve joint security priorities. And IMEC, while there is very limited bandwidth in this White House to take direct lead or ownership of these initiatives, there's strong support in Washington and within the White House and within the National Security Council, and I can speak on this from firsthand. We actually hosted at an Atlantic Council event in New Delhi last week. We hosted Ricky Gill, who's the National Security Advisor, or on the National Security Council, India lead, and he shared with our team, as well as some assembled delegation, that this White House is very supportive of initiatives like IMEC, like ITU2. The key is deliverables, the key is making it tangible, and the key is not just spinning wheels to spin wheels. Despite the impression in the general public that this administration in Washington is anti-globalist, is anti-engagement, is retrenching, it's not actually retrenchment. It's reevaluation of how do we reevaluate our relationships. That in the European context, that looks like retrenchment. But in the Indian and IMEC context of how do you describe the terms of that delivery, I think is something that this White House is extremely receptive to.
Sanjay, perhaps you can get back to the one more question with what can be done at policy and industry level to move beyond transactional logistics and build long-term supply chain competencies between India, EU, and resilience?
Well, thanks for that. You know, both Payal and I sit on the board of FEBI, Federation of European Business in India, and a big focus for us is how do you integrate Indian and European supply chains and value chains. So much opportunity for that because Indian and European trade is heavily undervalued, and we're punching below our weight. I mean, it's you know, whatever the numbers are, 135, 140 billion dollars a year is much less than what it could be. So a lot of our focus is on, you know, how do you engage with the government in India to make it easier for European companies to come and set up shop here and to actually start manufacturing components in India which can be integrated into their global supply chains and value chains. So when we engage with the government to try and get them, and our colleague Vardha is here, when we engage with the government of India to try and lower some of these technical barriers to trade, the whole aim is to try and get high-end machinery products into India which can be used to make components, which can again be re-exported to Europe. And that's where the opportunity for Indo-European trade lies. And then obviously as that volume picks up, you can then start to decide whether you move those on current air freight routes or current shipping routes through the Suez Canal or over IMEC, through UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc. And those are the choices that will then have to be made. You could envisage that certain products that are very energy intensive could undergo further transformation in the Middle East, etc. But this game of integrating Indian manufacturing into European supply chains is really at, I won't say at ground zero, but it's in a very, very nascent stage. I mean, there's so much more room to grow, and it's really our game to lose, I think.
Can you tell us a little bit about how do you see Spain's logistics capabilities and aligning with India's growing infrastructure to create maybe mutual value within IMEC? Is that something you can throw some light on?
If you look at the Indian trade between Spain and India, it's around about $9 billion a year, and out of that, 6.2 or nearly 6.5 billion is India's exports to Spain, and Spain's exports to India is only 2.5 or something like that. So it's like skewed one way. And if you look at the investments coming from Spain to India, it is 4 billion, and from India to Spain is only 600 million. And if you look at the logistics capabilities of Spain, logistics, for example, if you look at the Spanish ports, there are 46 ports, and they have extremely good logistics systems. So the IMEC can basically use those logistics systems because this is a new route, and the entire logistics system can be developed by Spanish companies, and they would be very interested in developing that. And if you look at the infrastructure companies, many of the large infrastructure companies are based in Spain. So this is a great opportunity for Spanish companies to build ports, rail. So it's going to be beneficial for Spain to build the entire corridor, hopefully if they win the tenders. But the expertise of Spain lies in infrastructure. So they can, for example, in the rail sector, they can build a long railway. And for example, if you look at the top rail companies like CAF or Talgo, or there are many other Spanish companies who would be interested in providing the wagons for the rail sector. There will be a lot of other companies like the ACS, the Ferrovial, the FCC. All of them are into building large infrastructures. So I believe this is basically going to help Spanish companies to invest in India, also Indian companies to invest in these entire corridor, because to develop this corridor you need a lot of capital, and capital can be provided by banks, like foreign banks or even Spanish banks. And there, I missed one point there, even the other ECAs, export credit agencies, like SACE, which provides an untied facility. So if any Indian company wants to borrow, they could borrow on an untied facility. That means there is nothing linked to Italy, but still they can borrow this money and can use for their proceeds or capex requirements in India. So, and there are other agencies like COFACE. There is, if you look at Germany, it is Euler Hermes, COFACE for France. You have EKIN for in Sweden, Nordic Islands. So a lot of European countries have these export credit agencies, which also can help this financing this infrastructure, not only in India but around the entire corridor. And I believe that if you apply the Spanish port and especially logistics systems, it could be a win-win for everybody.
Well, maybe you can throw some light on what the Chamber is doing to facilitate the private sector, government working together with the whole, between the various countries on the IMEC project.
Yeah, sure. I think I already mentioned it in my last.
Yes, you did.
Coincidentally, today, there's a big MOU being signed between our French International Network and Provence Promotion, which is the official investment agency in Marseille, right, which will open up a lot of scope for more business exchanges between both India and France, and specifically the region of Marseille. Next year is going to be a very important year for France and India because it's the year of innovation. Mm-hmm. And this was announced by both heads of state. There are going to be multiple events. There are going to be state visits. There's also going to be the AI Action Summit. So I think there's a lot happening between both countries, and next year is looking very exciting. And
I can also answer the same question for the United States about what anchor events we're looking forward to.
Excellent point.
So, like many of you might know, there's a public announcement has gone out that President Trump will be visiting for his first overseas visit. He'll be visiting the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Gulf. And so this will be a very major event. All of Washington and our partners, I'm sure, are all preparing very much for that visit. And I think that we saw this. Prime Minister Modi went to Saudi Arabia before the tragic attacks in Pahalgam this last week. We see a coalescing of momentum behind IMEC that Washington is starting to pick up on. There's other think tanks and outfits and groups that are in Washington that are starting to ask what's happening with IMEC, how do we think about moving this forward tangibly in this administration? And it's no accident this is happening now. When Prime Minister Modi visited Washington and had a bilateral meeting with President Trump earlier this year in February, they committed within that statement to have within 6 months of that statement have a ministerial on I2U2 and IMEC. I think we see that momentum building in Washington. We see it amongst our partners as they're having bilateral meetings amongst each other, as should be happening with the IMEC at this stage. That's all building as part on the US side, and I'm speaking narrowly about the US perspective here, that is building that momentum ahead of some other of the milestones this year. The Quad Summit, it's going to be hosted here in New Delhi, an expected visit by President Trump as part of that, and it links to the FTA negotiations, and we're expecting that as that economic kind of vision and whether it's the FTA, whether it's regional economic cooperation, that IMEC and I2U2 will be rolled into those processes across this year. And we're seeing that momentum start to pick up. But I think the Quad Summit later this year, as well as President Trump's visit to the Gulf and the rest of the Middle East in next month, will be two really important events to track and also be planning around.
What do you think, one of the most important things in this is people. How do we get people working together and culturally aligned in a project like this? And what do you think each of the players need to do about ensuring that there are these people alignments across the culture, the thinking, and aligning with objectives of IMEC?
Well, this is a topic close to my heart. I think if you don't skill people literally along the routes, something like this is not going to take off. Then you literally land up with a white elephant, and you land up with beautiful infrastructure with nobody knowing how to use it. So I think there's a golden opportunity for us from India all the way to Europe to actually skill people to also understand the new modes of transportation that are going to take shape. And I think that's going to be a project that will go on for years. One of the speakers this morning spoke about the big transformations that AI is going to bring, which the nature of goods being transported, the manner in which they're going to be transported is going to change. Yeah,
from my side, I feel the culture is going to be three different cultures: the Indian, the Middle Eastern, and the European. So the governments first have to align to have this mission as we need to make it a success. Once the government is aligned, automatically the people will be aligned, and I believe if they have enough skills, it is going to work. But to work as a team is what they need to learn, how to work and how to make sure that the flow of information is smooth, because your different multimodal transportation has to be smooth. So that is going to be a key for success for this particular corridor.
Not much to add, but I think just ensuring that there's enough dialogue and there's alignment, and especially at those critical junctures, and also more importantly to involve industry and to hear out the industry's voice, especially when it comes to ease of doing business or regulatory aspects. I think for me that's a very important aspect.
1000%, I would like to echo that. I just alluded to the fact that the White House right now and Washington has a lot of priorities. There's a really, really long laundry list of things. And anybody who's worked with DC before knows it's very difficult to maintain that pecking order of getting those signals about where do we want to go, how do we use our convening power effectively. The private sector can be an instrumental partner in that, to help convene American, Indian, everybody across the corridor to convene and really drive the demand signals from government to be able to actually address a real need. Nobody wants to be spinning their wheels of building a whole secretariat around something that doesn't actually deliver anything or is just barely worth the paper that it's written on. And so having those demand signals from private industry and aligning them across and using, especially for multinational conglomerates or organizations that are active across all the countries within the corridor, that's really very important.
The question is, we have seen that other parts of the world, including India, has been quite interested in investing in economical side, but also the security side. And IMEC has the security dimension to it. But we see that there is a reservation in terms of European side, some of the European partners to invest on the security side of the Indo-Pacific. Do you think that strategic awakening is happening in the European side?
Try to answer. Basically, I can talk about Spanish companies. They are interested in India, and they have invested in Indian defense. They have factories here, and they are keen to have more tie-ups with India for the defense part, as well as the aircraft side. And they have been helping Indian companies on the security side. So Europeans are actually interested, but the scale is not visible because this is a government-to-government negotiation, and they have their own contracts.
I would just add on to that. One of the things that we're tracking at the Atlantic Council in our Middle East program is the increased security integration and defense cooperation that you're seeing expand across the region, especially within the Indian Ocean, between the Gulf and India. Prime Minister Modi, when he met with Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia just last week, They signed a defense co-production agreement there. You're seeing the French defense and aerospace sector here. The Israeli aerospace and defense sector is well integrated in India. And so I think you're also seeing part of with IMEC, as was the theme today throughout, was an integration of interests that's naturally evolving from the way that our economies are already increasingly integrated. And then IMEC is kind of an accelerationist point. It's saying that we can get to this as a vision, a North Star that we can work towards, but it's also leveraging what's already happening across the public politics and economics.